All right, all right. We are now recording, so I want to say good morning. This is our first gathering today for New Testament. So what we're going to do today, let me pull out your syllabus. What we're going to do today is just walk through the class. I do want to walk through the syllabus. I'll pull everything up on the screen. And for my students who are here, I want you to ask all the questions that you can think of because somebody watching it might have that question as well. So good seeing you all, and so good seeing and having our students who are uh, watching this video. And remember, those who are watching the video, um, you are responsible for either watching our weekly lecture or joining us on Wednesdays for the live lecture at 11. Okay, so it's your responsibility to either watch the recorded lecture or join us on Wednesdays at 11 for the live session. So today I want to begin by going through the class. I want to go through the syllabus. So the way that the course is set up, and I hope that you all are already here, you're going to see the calendar on your left-hand side, and you'll see our weekly class meetings. You'll notice I took one out from it. It like automatically populated for each week, but next week we all fell in line with spring break, so we got spring break. So we get started one week and then we got a break. No fault of ours. It's just the calendar of the university. So we don't meet next week. So here's today's class meeting link. And each week you'll find the class meeting link right there. Also on the calendar, you're going to see when things are due, and we'll talk about some of those things today. In the middle, you'll find your modules. Okay, so each week will be broken down, and you can click on each module. Up at the top is called Syllabus and Class Resources, and I'm going to click on this, and hopefully you should be able to see it when I clicked on it, but you will find your syllabus for this semester. You are also going to find some New Testament introduction notes. Please, please, please download this, save it. I want you to read over that. You're going to find some MLA citation help if you need help writing and citing your sources. You can take a look at that link. And there's an overview of the New Testament. So sometimes when I find little helpful videos or handouts, I'll put those resources in that little folder. Okay, so each week is broken down, and I won't go into each week right now, but I do want to start clicking on the syllabus. So let me see if you all can see this. Let's see, I can see Mr. Smith right now. Mr. Smith, give me a thumbs up if you can see the syllabus on the screen.
Yes, yes.
Awesome, thank you all. All right, so I'm not going to read everything, but I just want to mainly go over some dates. And today's the 8th. Yeah, let's go over some dates and contact information. So if you need to get in contact with me, of course, you can reach me here, 770-241-9508. I don't have an office at the school, so you can always call or text. And of course, our class time is going to be Wednesdays at 11. You can always email me if you need something, kberry@atlm.edu. All right, just a few important dates. I won't read everything here. Of course, you know we started on Monday, but the last day to drop or add a course or this course, hope you stay with me, is March the 8th, which is today. That's today. That's today. Now, another big thing is next week, like we said, no fault of ours. We just this is just how the second session fell in. Next week is spring break for the school. So we fall in line. We'll have a break as well, but we'll talk about your calendar and what's expected. You will have a week 2. You'll see week 2, and we'll talk about when things will be due for next week. All right, let's talk a little bit about the course description. Like I said, I'm not going to read everything here. I want you all to download the syllabus and you can save it on your computer or you can print it out. This particular course is going to give you the big picture with Christian history, but in terms of the New Testament. So some of you were with me last semester. It's like a blur, right? For Old Testament. And now we're in the second half of the canon, which is the New Testament. I love New Testament. There's so much research that we can do. And I think it's so cool how we are Mr. James, you were just talking about Easter, Resurrection Sunday, and how we're studying New Testament, right? And we are in the season of Lent. All of this is in New Testament, and we'll be, moving right into Resurrection Sunday. When is it? April? When is Easter?
April 8th
9th?
or 9th. 8th,
9th.
9th.
9th
Yeah.
is the 9th.
9th. Good Friday is the 7th. So I think this is just so cool how this semester we are studying about New Testament, but we're also seeing how it is still being celebrated today in our modern context. We're going to talk about the books of the New Testament, but the books of the New Testament are so interesting. You may not have as many different types of books like in the Old Testament, but we'll talk about the Gospels. There are 4 synoptic Gospels. We have epistles in the New Testament, and we have apocalyptic books. That's like Revelation. We have some other literary forms, but mostly the New Testament is going to be epistles, which are letters. Mainly, a lot of the letters are written by Paul, and the 4 synoptic gospels, an apocalyptic book that is futuristic, and that's more so like the book of Revelation. Turn my phone down. All right, so the rationale of this book is for those students some students are in the Religious Studies Certificate Program, and this is going to give you this class gives a general overview to the New Testament. I'm already going to apologize that we can't get into every single book, but I promise you it's going to just make you even more curious to read it and to study it. Like I tell my students, especially from the Old Testament class, this is not necessarily like a Bible study. I always tell my students we come in through the back door of the book. So we come in through the back door of the book and we look at the context and who wrote it, the author. A lot of the text, just like Old Testament texts, a lot of the New Testament texts as well, especially with Jesus and his sayings, are often misunderstood. But the New Testament is a bit more popular than the Old Testament because its reading is a little bit different. The New Testament, let me go back. Old Testament, anybody remember what's the Old Testament written in?
Hebrew.
Hebrew,
You
very
mean the
good.
language?
That's correct. Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So remember, we were following the Israelites, the Jewish people. And so the New Testament was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Greek. And so now we have a whole nother language to deal with. We're moving into a different space. And we'll talk later about how we got from Greek to Latin, to English and to all these other translations that we see today. All right. Later on, you'll be able to identify, I hope by the end of this course, you'll be able to identify some key developments in the New Testament. Mainly in the New Testament through the Gospels, we see the ministry of Jesus. We see the birth of Jesus. Should I go back? Let me go back. The birth of Jesus, the fulfilling of prophecy from the Old Testament. So New Testament exists because of Old. And so everything in the New does not contradict the Old. So it matches up. So what was said in Old is now being fulfilled, being carried out in the New Testament. There are 27 books of of the New Testament, and we'll learn to identify the genres that they fall under. And the really cool thing about New Testament is that there's so much context. Of course, Old Testament has context and history to it, but now we get to see the places come alive. These places are, even with old, but these places are still in existence today. Some of you may have visited these places, and it has a lot of social, historical, a lot of politics we find in the New Testament. Can't get away from politics, can we? Just everywhere. All right. I hope that you've picked up your book. And let me see. I think I got mine right here. I've got the teacher sticker on the front, but it is a brief introduction to the New Testament. It's the 3rd edition. And you can also obtain, make sure that you have access to a Bible. I do kind of ask that you steer away from King James or New King James. Sometimes they're hard to read and understand. And if we need to go to the Bible to do any type of work, I do ask that you use maybe New International Version or the New Revised Standard Version. It's easier to understand and it's more scholarly written. So what I want to do is, let me fast forward here, and I'm going to go all the way down to grading. You can read all this other stuff later, but I do want to talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about the schedule and how you're going to be graded. All right, so you're going to have discussion forums. You all have been with me. And this is a way for us to talk to each other throughout the week. Make sure that in your post, make sure that you have at least 200 words. And this is a collaborative learning experience. I want to see that you're engaging with your classmates as well as reading. So I want to see that, your discussion post is going to be based on something that we read. For those who are watching this video, remember, and especially if you're new to my class, everybody's coming from different walks of life. Some people may be Christian, some people may not. And so if somebody doesn't have the background that you have, we definitely don't want anybody to feel bad or hurt anyone or berate anyone, because their opinion is valuable as well. B, we have reading quizzes. You'll have 3. And because this is such a short class, they will come pretty quickly. C, we have a video summary reflection assignment. And that'll come up. We'll look at the schedule when that comes up. D, you have a New Testament argument paper, and you'll also see the weights. Okay. E, you have a New Testament book research paper, and this is where you're going to research one book in the New Testament. And I do want to say, those people who are watching as well, those people who are here with me, you can always start early on things. If you know you're traveling, or you have a busy April or whatever coming up, or graduations for other folks, you can always get started early on things. You don't want things to catch you at the last minute. I believe, what's our last day? I think our last day of class is supposed to be May 1st or something. All right, and then at the end, you're going to have a comprehensive New Testament exam. All right, let's go down to your schedule. And this should be on the last page. All right, what is really important is that we start on Mondays. We start our class on Mondays, which we started this Monday, and we end on Sunday nights at 11:59 p.m. So I try to make it easy for you so that you can have all your work done by 11:59 p.m. and you're not trying to guess what to do. So for week 1, this week, I do ask that you review the syllabus, that you watch that introduction video, you do that introductory forum. Please, 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 everybody. there are still a few students who have not, and that's really important that you do the introductory form because it lets the school know that you're active. If not, we have to mark you as a no-show. And I want you to watch this. We may get a chance to watch it, but I want you to watch this video by Dr. Margaret Amer. Dr. Amer is very dear to me. She was one of my New Testament professors in seminary at ITC, and she is brilliant. She is so brilliant. She knows the New Testament back and front and up and down and around again. And I just want you to enjoy this video. She's giving an introduction of the New Testament. And I think you're just going to really enjoy it. So for week 2, I just want to give you a disclaimer. We do not meet next week. We do not meet next week, the 15th, because you have spring break. However, you see why I put it in yellow. However, you have work, but I won't collect it next week. It will be due on the 26th of March, okay? So just make sure if you want to get it done next week, you can, that is great. And I can grade it. So there's just one discussion forum next week, and it talks about the synoptic problem. You want to make sure that you are doing your reading along the way. So you can do that while you're off next week. And then we're going to come back on week 3. So we'll come back and join each other week 3. Week 3 is this week of March the 20th. So we'll be meeting on
22nd, right, March.
That's right.
Whatever.
Yep. Wednesday the 22nd will be the day that we meet for week 3. That's right. And so we'll pick back up right here. So I just wanted you to see that there in yellow, that we do not meet next week due to spring break. You do have work. I won't collect it normally the same time, but I'll collect it. When I say collect it, it will be due on March 26th, Sunday, March 26th, instead of the 19th, okay? All right, and just keep going down each week. Week 4, we will be talking. Let me go back a little bit. I'm sorry. We're going to talk about the book of Mark. I'm going to assign you the book of Mark next week. Matthew was when we will come back on week 3. So we're going to really double it up when we come back on week 3. So we're going to hit Mark and Matthew when we come back. Then we'll hit Luke in week 4. You'll have a quiz there. Week 5, we'll be talking about the Gospel of John. I have a guest speaker lined up for us. And week 6, we'll hit Acts. Week 7, we're going to talk a little bit more about Paul's writing. Paul wrote, if not about 2/3 of the New Testament. And he wrote a lot of epistles, a lot of letters to churches. Then in week 7, you have another quiz. Week 8, and then when we get to the end, your final exam and research paper will be due. Okay. Okay, I know that was a lot. Any questions so far? Okay. All right, stay right there. I'm going to transition a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions.
Professor B, while you're doing that, how will the exams work?
Exams will be, okay, so you're going to be where you are. You can stay at home. You don't have to go anywhere. And my exams are usually either multiple choice and or a mix of multiple choice or short answer. And it'll come from your readings.
And it'll be posted on, you post it in, we just go and take it and submit
That's
the
right.
answers.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So one exam, right? Just the final.
Okay, now you're talking about the final exam, Freddie?
There's only one exam.
There's only one exam.
The
And
final
then with
exam.
their
I use the wrong terminology. I meant quiz.
quizzes, okay.
Oh.
Okay,
Thank
and
you,
the same. Oh, okay, no problem at all. So for the quizzes, they will usually be multiple choice, and some short answer on there as well. So I apologize for the my final exam will probably be more mixture of multiple choice, and at the end, there's going to be some short answer. Okay. Okay. But you guys will do fine. Especially y'all keep up with your reading. I like how y'all keep up with your reading. You'll be totally fine. Let's do an introduction today. Let me pull this up. I do want you to do this. Let me do this. In week 1, everybody go to week 1 later on, where it says week 1, week of March 6th. I have a welcome video. Make sure you do that introduction form. You can watch that intro to Dr. Amer later on. And then there's some introduction notes. You can take those and save them. I always tell my students you can use them however you would like. Anything in this folder and all of the folders is yours. I know some people do teach at their churches or whatever. So if there is, let me download this. I should have did it already. If there is a PowerPoint or something that you want to use, you are more than welcome to use it at your church. Okay. Let me do that again. Let me open this up. It doesn't like me.
Professor Berry, while you're doing that,
Mhm.
Two of the things that have just, one that amazed me so far as I've started reading this, that are the non-canonical writings
Yeah.
that and the Dr. Amer mentioned one, and I this
So
word
was it
dead
there's
kick, the dead catch,
Didache.
dedicate, yes.
I'll put it in the
That was
chat.
very interesting reading through that. And the other thing I never heard of either one of these. Another one was the Apostle Constitution, which I never heard of, which I find extremely interesting. And I guess it was gathered by Clement. But those additional writings, those writings that seem to add a lot of understanding, I guess, on how those early Christians were thinking.
Right. Right. And we have to understand that there are, when we start researching, there are researchers have found that there were so many more, what's the word? Sources. And
Right.
remember, y'all, they didn't have books that look like this. They didn't have bound books. They didn't have
Right.
libraries and internet, but there were pieces, there were writings, there were oral interpretations that they were trying to capture from people. And everything didn't fall into the Bible as we know it. So there are other writings out there that weren't captured, that aren't necessarily wrong, but they just weren't captured in.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. All right, everybody, let's go into chapter 1. We're going to talk about what is the New Testament? What is it? What's it all about? Give me a thumbs up if you can see my PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so the New Testament, thank you. The New Testament, many times, if you open it up to that very first page, if you look at the top of, if you have a paper Bible, if you look at the top of my screen, you'll see that beginning, right? The New Testament of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And so remember, if you don't remember anything from this class, Old Testament written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. So you have a we're in another geographical area. People are moving around a little bit. And if you were with me from the Old Testament, we know people move around for so many different reasons. But the key thing is sometimes wars, key thing, famines, people are looking for trade. And those are some of the reasons why people are moving to different regions. And the earth has been more populated from Old Testament. Here are a few things to consider as we get started. The New Testament, did you know the New Testament is the most frequently purchased part of the Bible? So, sometimes you can just purchase a New Testament, just by itself. And it's the most commonly read and it is the most widely misunderstood. Most widely misunderstood. In the Old Testament, if you look up at the top in the little book, it is made up of 39 books. And remember, the Old Testament, or we'll say OT, was written before Jesus was born, or before Jesus's earthly birth. In the New Testament, so when we come to the new part of the canon, the second part of the canon, the New Testament is made up of 27 books. So remember that number, 27 books, but it was written after Jesus was born. So it was written after. So there are about, researchers say that there are probably about 15 to 16 different authors of the New Testament who addressed these new Christians. They weren't necessarily called Christians in the beginning. They were trying to figure out who in the world they were, because remember, Old Testament, we followed the Jewish people and Jewish ancestry. And so they have Jewish ancestry. Jesus had Jewish ancestry. And so now we come on the scene and we see how Judaism gives birth to something else. Okay. And so this New Testament, it was written to address Christians. It was written to address their communities and their new churches between about 50 to 120 CE, and CE is the Common Era. All right, if you look on the on the right-hand side, look at that. It is a very torn piece of paper, very torn piece of paper. And or probably papyrus at the time. And that's kind of how they found relics of biblical texts. So when we talk about the canon is the complete Bible. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say the canon. And so how did the whole canon come together? Well, the canon or the Christian Bible, it developed over time. People just didn't sit down and just say, hey, we're going to throw this in here. But it was written over time, over a large span of thousands of years. So Jewish people or Jews believe in the Torah, and that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and some of the books of the prophets that you find in the Old Testament. And remember how I said that Old and New Testament complement each other. Well, and I think that is just so awesome how we're in the Lenten season. And if you ever read certain scriptures where Jesus is saying things, Jesus quotes Old Testament scriptures too. So neither one is in conflict with each other. By the 2nd century, some Christians ascribed authority to the words of Jesus. So that is the reason why when you pick up the New Testament, have you ever noticed that when you read New Testament scripture, and if Jesus is saying something, in some versions it may appear in italics, in some versions it may appear in red. The type is different. So the authors of the New Testament ascribed heavy weight to the words that Jesus said in the New Testament. So the New Testament also, y'all, has a lot of historical context. It has a lot of political conflict, issues with government, issues with equity, right? We talk about equity and diversity in 2023. Well, those issues were being talked about in New Testament times. People being treated fairly, different groups not liking each other, Not much has changed, right? Athanasius is credited with coming up with the first list of the 27 New Testament books. Now, let's stop and pause a little bit. Y'all can always jump in there if you have any questions. We said, actually, let me go backwards. Do y'all remember that slide where it said that right here, the New Testament is the most frequently purchased, commonly read, but it's the most widely misunderstood? I wanted to just pause there before we move on. Why do you think that is? If it's frequently purchased, it's commonly read, because New Testament scriptures are much easier to read than Old Testament. You know, the wording is a little bit more archaic for us. Why do you think it's the most widely misunderstood?
Oh, Professor Barry, I think, well, this is maybe just me thinking, but I think
Yes.
sometimes you read something and you don't really understand it because you say it shows it's misunderstood. And if you don't go back to the source, then you're still going to be confused at what you were reading.
I
That's the way I
agree.
look at it. So reading the King James, and we know that it's difficult sometimes. You don't get a full understanding, you don't read it anywhere else, and you take off what you left out of that, you still don't understand it, and you move on, then you're not gonna accomplish anything.
And I think too, sometimes with old and new, that's very good. People read New Testament scripture very literally and say, well, this is exactly what it meant. Sometimes there is a literal interpretation, but other times it maybe Jesus or maybe the writer or the person didn't mean it, word for word. Maybe it was metaphorically. Um, Revelation is one that is very hard to understand because it's written in metaphors. It's not a straight, I would like it's not a straight translation where people can just read it and carry from it. You have to sit and study it. You have to understand what this symbol means, and that one symbol could mean multiple things.
Professor,
Yes.
another reason it may be misunderstood is because it wasn't written as one coherent document. So each writer wasn't necessarily writing the Bible as such. At that time, they were writing to address something that they saw specifically.
Right.
So it's possible that each writer saw a particular event and saw a somewhat separate or different solution to that particular situation. So as a result, even though in totality they're all pointing us towards God, the collection, each book is written again. It's somewhat individually. So it could be part of the reason it could be misunderstood because we have a collection of writings that were put together as one document, if you would, but they were actually written individually with not necessarily intent on supporting each other.
Correct. Even with the epistles, even with the letters, right? So Paul writes this letter for Corinthians over here, and it has to deal with them. So here's the thing: when people read I'm gonna just use that as an example. When people read a letter, the epistles are letters, right? And if Freddie wrote me a letter and there's a context in there, let's say Freddie was talking about a car accident or something, and we shouldn't do this, and this happened, and this person hit me this way, and Freddie wrote me that letter. And then James reads the letter and then tries to interpret the letter. And then maybe James said, well, we shouldn't be driving cars because they cause accidents, you know. Well, that letter was personal, you know, and it had a particular context that happened. And then when we read somebody, it's almost like we're reading somebody else's mail. You ever pick up somebody's
Yeah.
mail,
Yeah.
you get the wrong mail to your house, and
Mhm.
I just open up mail sometime, and then I open it up, I'm like, oh my goodness, this wasn't for me, this was for, sometimes I don't know who these people are. I don't think sometimes they get the wrong name. They don't even live in the neighborhood. So it's just trash. But you're reading somebody else's stuff that has nothing to do with you. Maybe there's a lesson in there for us somewhere. And that's where a lot of the misunderstanding due to not truly understanding the context of the letter or the context of the time. Um, if somebody wrote about a fight, um, Paul writes about, I believe it's Onesimus, and there was a conflict that happened at the church. We don't know everything that happened. Maybe they got somebody said something about his mama or whatever. You know, there was a whole conversation, I am sure. But when we come to Paul, Paul is like, look, why y'all treating him like this? We don't know everything that happened. So one of the things that happens with with New Testament interpretation is that we put our 2023 spin on it and say this is what they meant without going to the context and going to the history and say what was happening at this time. That's really what they meant. And then sometimes we hurt people. Uh, I'm gonna go back to a PowerPoint. Sometimes people hurt people because they like put an interpretation that wasn't even really there. All right, let's see. All righty. I'm back on my lesson. Implications for study. Why should we even study the New Testament, y'all? So there are various books of the New Testament, and they're typically, the New Testament are typically reading as standing in essential harmony with one another. So, for example, like the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're all in harmony with each other. Those gospel writers are going to present Jesus through their eyes, but the way that they present him is still the same. You know, one person is not going to say something contradictory to another writer of the gospel. And when we go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we'll see those similarities, even though they said it different ways. And then some of them have the same narratives, but they say it different ways, but we get the same result. The most effective way to study the New Testament is to read each book and interpret it separately. Read each book and interpret it separately. Mr. James, you were saying that earlier. So I'm gonna start with the Gospels because those are really big. We have Matthew. And when we get to Matthew, we're going to have to read that separately. When we get to Mark, we'll study that separately. When we get to John and when we get to Luke, and Luke is actually kind of related to Acts. It's the same writer, Luke. But there are some books that will be in similarity with others, and there may be some differences, but everything, when I say everything agrees, the underlying message all agrees with who Jesus is. There's no
Right.
contradiction to that. Mhm. And
Professor,
yes.
I think sometimes I think in today's society and in our religious with everything, we miss that even though there may be a different approach or a different recognition or solving a different problem, that ultimately they're all pointing to Jesus Christ and who he is. And that is the significant argument, if you would, or significant underlying foundation of that. And I think we get distracted sometimes dealing with some details that aren't really that important.
That's a good point. Yeah, sometimes getting stuck on, certain details, but rather let's focus on what the person said. Why did the
Right.
person say this? And here's another thing that I want you all to start doing if you don't do it already. Ask questions of the text. Maybe I started just writing all in my Bible, or you can also write in your book, like, why did John say this? Or why did Luke say this? And so said something else. And that helps you to dig further in your study. All right. I want y'all to see this picture. I love this picture because I love always pulling in the African version of us. So, so this is the Last Supper type of picture. Many times we see it with more European looking people, but I love to find biblical art that represents Africans, because I think that's more what we look like, what they look like. The New Testament, as we read it, y'all, it has its own set of problems. So it did not emerge just as one large set of books. It happened over time, and it's happening over a course of years, hundreds of years, over problems. More problems than we want to count. Early Christians had different versions of books, and scribes at the time. Okay, so think about the technology. Of course, it's not like what it is now, but it did greatly improve from Old Testament recordings. So now you had um, better writing instruments, or ink, should I say. Now you have a little bit better ways to copy something down on not necessarily the type of paper that we have now, but what would be a thicker type of paper, which was papyrus. But what I want you to understand about the New Testament and Old, but since we're in the New Testament, is that now you have people who are writing copies. And we're getting a little bit more sophisticated. So they could write a copy of a book, and they weren't cutting and pasting like we can. They couldn't send it on a Google Drive, right? They had to copy that book word for word, letter by letter, by hand. I do want you to understand, as scholars, the scribes are human. The scribe's pen might have started leaking ink. They might have made a mistake. They might have been tired and didn't have a lot of light. I got a lamp over here. I'm sure they didn't have a lamp. They probably were depending on the sunlight or maybe a candle. And it's dark. Their eyes might have been bad. So I do want you to also understand that scribes, as we're going to talk about redaction criticism later on, but you're going to see in New Testament scripture, especially in the Gospels, where certain stories were left out, or sometimes scribes saw that a story was incomplete and they added it. You're also going to see sometimes where certain things were repeated. And you're like, well, why did they say this again? Okay, because scribes are humans. But what I do want you to understand is the overall message is not wrong. So because we still get the same message of who Jesus is and the miraculous one that he brought to the New Testament, or brought to the world. But I do want you to understand that the scribes were human, and they could and they did make some mistakes. Okay, we don't have any original copies of the New Testament. No original copies of the New Testament, but what we do have in museums and things like that are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, you know? So we do have some of those. And what scholars have found, and if you go to different museums, there's a museum, I want to go back. There's a museum in Washington, D.C. We went years ago, and I want to say it's I wanna say it's the Museum of the Bible or the Bible Museum. It's in Washington, DC. Yeah, yeah. It's Museum of the Bible. It's called Museum of the Bible, and it's in Washington, DC. If you ever get a chance when you're up in that area, and I believe it's free. If it's not free, it's, just a nominal fee to get in to support the museum. It's so worth it. Y'all, if you can go, if you're up in that area, you will just be blown away by the pieces that they have found from different languages, different pieces of Bibles that they've found over the years from all around the world. It's mind-blowing. But anyway, there are differences in the copies. And over time, scholars have found at least over 200,000 differences in copies of the New Testament. Okay. And of course, it was written in Greek. And so when we say differences, maybe somebody left this out of this version and somebody added something else in this version. Scribes would sometimes correct uh, punctuation. Guess what? Sometimes we also found that scribes would not put in punctuation. So something was kind of longer or it needed to be broken up and they kind of just all lumped things together. So that happened as well with the New Testament. So when we talk about the scribes, I feel bad for the scribes. Sometimes the scribes get a bad rap, but we did need the scribes to get what we have today, right? And sometimes the scribe says, scribes, oh scribes. There's a picture of a scribe right there. I know their back must have been hurt and hunched over trying to get this stuff written out. But we did find that sometimes the scribes would have misspelled words. They would leave out words or lines or sometimes pages. I mean, think about it. Maybe they ran out of paper. I don't know if they could have wrote on the back or something, you know, when they're moving from place to place. I'm sure things were mishandled. Scribes sometimes copied the same words or lines twice. Maybe they just tired. Or they added a verse or a line to a story to improve the text. I don't want to give it away now, but there's a scripture, and it's not coming to me right now, in the resurrection story. I want to say it's in Luke, and you'll see sometimes when you're reading the original, they'll say something like the original did not include verses this through this. But we're going to take a look at that a little bit later when we start to get into the Gospels. All right. And actually, okay, I think, how we doing? Okay, we're good on time. Let's go right here. Yeah, we're ready. We're ready. Let's do this. Everybody, let's go to Mark 16. And if you're at home, you can pause this and get your Bible and go to Mark 16. New Testament Mark is one of our Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Go to Mark 16 and 8. And I want you to see something. Yeah, this is the one I was talking about. Yeah. This is the resurrection story after Jesus was supposed to be in the tomb. And I'm gonna go back and just recap a little bit. Mark 16 and 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices as they might go anoint Jesus' body. And I'm gonna just fast forward, and He's not there, right? So they're like, what is going on? And then let's go all the way down to verse 8.
So they went.
You see it? All the way down to verse 8, it says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, I got a little asterisk on my scripture. What does yours say?
Mine says the shorter version ending of Mark. Then it's in parentheses or no.
Right.
And command them. So,
I think you're breaking up a little bit, Mr. James.
I had it was a little that's the shorter in Mark and in practice. There are say and all that they commanded me to briefly to the people.
Okay, Mr. James, hold 1 second. Freddie, can you hear him well? Is it me?
Is there
Can you hear
something,
me?
Westbury?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
I can.
Yeah,
Mr.
you were
James, breaking up, sir.
okay, that's what it was. Okay, I wanted to see if it was my internet. Mr. James, you were breaking up a little bit, so you were going in and out. But I wanted you all to see, and I think you were referring to this anyway, is that verses 9 through 20, it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. And in my version, 9 through 20 are in italics. So that lets the reader know that this is specially added.
And then mine is in black, but verses, let's see, verses 15 through
15
through 18 are in red.
are in red, mine in red. And why are they in red, Freddie?
Jesus.
Jesus. Okay, yeah, Jesus.
Right.
The longer.
Right. So remember in the beginning, correct. So the authority of his words has weight. So remember in the beginning, we said in the New Testament, the writers, they're writing stuff. They're like, wait a minute. We've got to make sure that we specify when Jesus says something because his words have authority. Very good. Okay, so in some versions, it would end after verse 8, though in some of these authorities, the passage is marked sometimes as being doubtful. They're like, we're not sure if this happened, but the scribe of Mark, whoever wrote it down, whoever was helping Mark, because when we get to these books, it's ascribed to Matthew, it's ascribed to Mark, it's ascribed to Luke, but we don't really know if Luke sat and wrote the whole thing. He might have had people to help him write. So whoever it was, whether it was Mark or Mark's secretary, they were privy to this extra information. So maybe they had, yeah, but this happened. See where it stopped? They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then maybe they're like, yeah, but they're afraid. And the scribe was like, yeah, but I heard. I can't let the story. If the story ended right there.
Jesus appeared to me.
Yeah. And the scribe was like, look, I got to tell the rest of this. This is going to bother me. And verses 9 through 20, they found these other, maybe they talked to somebody else. They had another eyewitness. Or maybe they talked to Mary Magdalene herself. Isn't that awesome? And they said, look, I got to make sure I get this information in here. And every time I read this, and we're gonna pause our lesson right here. Every time I read this, I just imagine Mark, the writer of Mark, cared for us so much. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Pause. End scene. And Mark said, no, or the writers that helping him said, no, we gotta finish this story. This story is too good. All right, so we're gonna pause. Go
We-
ahead, any questions?
We missed some of the, I'll call them significant appearances of Jesus to help us understand what happened after the resurrection.
Right. So much happened after it. And then we talk about how they were feeling and, how bewildered these women were probably feeling at the time.
So they went out and fled the tomb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted you to see that real life example of scribes, of the work of scribes, what scribes do. Sometimes they finish an incomplete sentence, an incomplete story, because they had some extra. They're like, no, I heard, or my mom told me, or wait, I was talking to Mary Magdalene last week and she said this. So they had to pull that information in. Aren't we grateful for that?
Mm.
All right. Any questions or comments before we go?
Mhm.
Yeah, remember, next Wednesday, the 15th, we don't meet. You're on your break, but we're going to pick up again. Now, we're going to have a heavy session when we pick back up on the 22nd because we got to hit Mark and Matthew. So you're going to read the rest of chapter 1, y'all. And we do skip around in this book. I'm sorry. We're going to go to chapter 5 and 6. So when we come back, we got to do Mark and Matthew. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let me know if you have any questions, but I hope that you all continue to have a great day.
You too, man.
You too. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Okay, y'all too. Be blessed.
You too.